You know, I've spent decades looking into the eyes of people who have reached the absolute end of their rope. But there is a specific kind of silence that settles in a room when a person has systematically dismantled their own life. It's not the loud, crashing silence of a sudden tragedy. It's a heavy, suffocating stillness that comes when someone makes a choice that defies every rule of survival we've been taught since birth. We live in a world where we are told to hoard, to protect, and to build a fortress of security around ourselves. We're told that our value is inextricably linked to our net worth and our ability to provide. So when a 45-year-old man, a man in the very prime of his earning years, walks into a bank and hands over every single cent he has ever earned to people who are essentially strangers, the world doesn't just get confused. It gets angry, it gets scared, and it starts looking for a label to slap on him so they don't have to deal with the terrifying possibility that he might actually know exactly what he's doing. When I first sat down with Mark, I saw a man who looked like he had been hollowed out from the inside. He wasn't some wide-eyed kid who had been tricked by a flashy internet scam, and he wasn't an elderly gentleman suffering from the cognitive decline that makes the vulnerable a target for predators. Mark was sharp, he was articulate. He had spent 20 years as a high-level project manager, a job that requires a rigorous adherence to logic, timelines, and bottom line. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a financial crater of his own making. He had given away $500,000, his retirement, his children's college funds, the equity in his home, all of it, gone. And the people around him, the people who were supposed to know him best, were screaming at the top of their lungs that he was either insane or a victim of some sophisticated brainwashing. His wife, Sarah, sat across from him with a look of betrayal so sharp it could cut glass. To her, this wasn't an act of charity or a spiritual awakening, it was a mugging, and she felt like Mark was the one holding the gun. I've seen this movie before, but usually there's a clear villain. Usually there's a Nigerian prince or a romance scammer whispering sweet nothings into a lonely ear. But Mark's case was different. He hadn't sent the money to a P.O. box in a foreign country. He had distributed it to a collection of individuals, some local, some distant, who he claimed were in need of a redirection. When I asked him what that meant, he didn't give me a scripted answer. He didn't sound like a cult member. He sounded like a man who had finally stopped pretending to believe in a lie that everyone else was still telling. He told me, Dr. Phil, everyone thinks I'm the one who lost my mind. But for the first time in 45 years, I feel like I'm the only one who's actually found it. Now, that's a hell of a statement to make when your wife is looking at divorce papers and your bank balance is zero. The labels started flying almost immediately. The family had already tried to have him committed. They had called in interventionists who specialized in deprogramming. They had accused him of having a secret drug habit, a gambling addiction, or a midlife crisis that had spiraled into a psychotic break. It's easier to believe a man is sick than it is to believe he has rejected the very foundation of your shared reality. My job wasn't to take sides. My job was to get to the why. Because in my experience, nobody does anything that doesn't work for them on some level. There is a payoff for every behavior, no matter how self-destructive it looks on the surface. If Mark was burning his house down, I wanted to know what he was trying to stay warm from. As we started to dig into the backstory, the layers began to peel back, and they were much older than the recent financial transactions. Mark had grown up in a household where worth was a transactional concept. His father was a man who measured love in decimals. If Mark got an A, he was an asset. If he scraped a knee or needed emotional support, he was a liability. He was raised in a high-pressure environment where the primary directive was to accumulate grades, accumulate accolades, accumulate wealth. By the time he was 30, he had checked every box on the societal success list. He had the house, the car, the beautiful wife, and the burgeoning career. But when you build a life on a foundation of shoulds instead of wants, you eventually start to feel the structural integrity of your soul begin to fail. He told me about a moment about 3 years prior to his decision, when he was sitting in his corner office overlooking the city. He had just closed a massive deal that would net him a significant bonus. He looked at the check on his desk, and instead of feeling a sense of accomplishment, he felt a profound sense of nausea. He realized that he had spent 20 years trading his life force for digits on a screen, and those digits didn't buy him a single second of genuine connection or peace. He began to look at his savings account not as a safety net, but as a ledger of all the hours he would never get back, hours spent away from his children, hours spent in meetings he hated, hours spent pretending to be a version of himself that was acceptable to his father's ghost. The escalation didn't happen overnight. It started small. He began giving large tips to waitresses, then larger donations to local shelters. He told me it felt like unburdening. Each dollar that left his possession felt like a pound of pressure lifting off his chest. But the problem with using money to solve an internal crisis is that money is a finite resource, while a spiritual void can be bottomless. He started seeking out people who were broken in ways he felt he was people who had been discarded by the system or forgotten by their families. He felt a kinship with them. He convinced himself that by saving them financially, he was somehow redeeming his own wasted years. Sarah, of course, saw this from a very different perspective. To her, this wasn't a spiritual journey. It was a slow-motion car crash. She watched as their joint accounts dwindled. She saw the thank you notes from strangers and the increasingly desperate requests for more. She told me, Dr. Phil, he was being eaten alive by these people. They saw a man with a bleeding heart and an open checkbook, and they circled like sharks. And the truth is, she wasn't entirely wrong. Some of the people Mark helped were genuinely in need, but others were professional manipulators who could smell his guilt from a mile away. They fed him a narrative that he was their angel, their last hope. For a man who had spent his whole life feeling like a cog in a machine, being someone's angel was a powerful drug. It was an ego stroke disguised as altruism. When I looked at the records of the transactions, I saw a pattern of increasing desperation. The amounts grew larger as Mark's own sense of stability grew smaller. It was as if he was trying to buy his way out of his own life. He wasn't just giving money away, he was burning the bridges behind him so he could never go back to being the project manager his father wanted him to be. But in the process, he was also burning the bridge to his wife and his children. He was so focused on being a savior to strangers that he became a villain to his own family. He was sacrificing the people who loved him on the altar of his own need to feel good. I sat there in that backstage area looking at this man who was being hailed as a saint by some and a lunatic by others. I realized that everyone was looking at the money, but the money was just the symptom. The real issue was a profound, untreated identity crisis. Mark had spent 45 years living someone else's life, and he had finally snapped. But instead of going to therapy or talking to his wife, he decided to perform a financial exorcism. He thought that if he could just get rid of the stuff, he could find the man. But you can't find yourself by losing everything else, because when you strip everything away, you're still left with the person who made those choices in the first place. You're still left with the same patterns, the same wounds, and the same desperate need for validation. Now, when a man starts emptying his life's work into the hands of strangers, the shock waves don't just stay in the bank account. They rip through the living room, they poison the dinner table, and they keep everyone awake at 3 in the morning wondering who the hell they've been sleeping next to for 20 years. Sarah told me that the first time she realized something was seriously wrong, it wasn't because of a bank statement, it was because of a look in Mark's eyes. She described it as a vacant serenity. It's that look people get when they think they've found a secret truth that nobody else is enlightened enough to understand. It's a dangerous look because it's the look of someone who has stopped taking input from the outside world. The escalation began with a man named Elias. Mark had met him at a bus stop, of all places. Elias was one of those guys who has a story for every scar and a philosophical explanation for why he hasn't held a job in a decade. He wasn't a bad man, per se, but he was a professional survivor. He knew how to spot a man with a heavy heart and a heavy wallet. Mark didn't see a drifter, he saw a project. He saw a chance to prove that his father's transactional worldview was wrong. He thought, if I give this man a life-changing amount of money with no strings attached, I will prove that grace exists. I will prove that I am more than just a guy who hits quarterly targets. He started by paying for Elias's motel room. Then it was a car. Then it was a startup fund for a community garden that never had a chance of growing a single tomato. But here's where the psychology gets real messy. Mark wasn't just helping Elias, he was using Elias to medicate his own midlife crisis. Every time he wrote a check, he felt a rush of dopamine that no corporate bonus could ever provide. He was buying a feeling of moral superiority. He was basically saying to Sarah, to his kids, and to the memory of his father, look at how much better I am than you. You care about mortgages and tuition. I care about humanity. Sarah eventually found the withdrawals. She sat him down at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd planned their future, their kids' futures, and she laid out the records. She told me she was shaking so hard she could barely hold the paper. She asked him, Mark, where is the $50,000 from the girls' college fund? And you know what he said? He didn't blink. He didn't apologize. He looked her right in the eye and said, Sarah, those girls are healthy, they're smart, and they have a roof over their heads. Elias has nothing. Who needs that money more? Are we really that selfish? That right there is what I call spiritual gaslighting. It's when you take a gross dereliction of duty and wrap it in a cloak of righteousness so the other person can't argue with you without feeling like a bad person. It's a classic defensive maneuver. Mark was using altruism as a weapon to shut down his wife's legitimate concerns about their survival. He was effectively telling her that her desire for financial security for their children's education was a character flaw. And that, my friends, is where the marriage started to catch fire. The conflict didn't stay behind closed doors. Mark started bringing these projects into their lives. He'd invite people he barely knew over for dinner. People who were clearly struggling with active addiction or severe mental health issues, and he'd seat them right next to his teenage daughters. He wanted his family to witness the struggle. He wanted to force them into his brand of enlightenment. Sarah was terrified. She told me, Dr. Phil, I didn't recognize my home anymore. It felt like a halfway house where I was the only one paying the bills and the only one who cared about safety. When she tried to intervene, when she tried to change the passwords to their joint accounts, Mark didn't get angry in the traditional sense. He got cold. He told her she was spiritually stunted. He told her she was wedded to the material world. He used his newfound philosophy to alienate her, to make her the villain in his story of self-discovery. This is a pattern I see all the time with people who fall into these deep, obsessive holes. They create an us versus them mentality. If you're not with me on this journey, you're an obstacle to my growth. By the time they reached out to me, the situation had reached a breaking point. Mark had moved out of the master bedroom and into a small apartment he'd rented, partly to be closer to the community he was funding, and partly because he couldn't stand Sarah's negative energy. He was down to his last few $1,000s. The house was in the early stages of foreclosure. His daughters weren't speaking to him. And yet, when he walked onto my stage, he walked with the posture of a man who had just won the lottery. He was beaming. I remember looking at him in the hallway before the cameras started rolling. He looked me in the eye and said, "I know what you're going to do, Dr. Phil. You're going to try to talk sense into me, but sense is what got me into this mess. Logic is what made me miserable for 40 years. I'm done with logic." I just nodded. I've heard that before. People think that by rejecting logic, they're embracing freedom. But usually, they're just embracing a different kind of prison, one where they're the only person who has the key, but they've forgotten where they put it. The tension between Mark and Sarah in the green room was palpable. It wasn't just anger, it was a profound mourning grief. Sarah wasn't just losing her money, she was losing the man she thought she knew. She was grieving a version of Mark that apparently never existed, or at least a version that had been suppressed for so long it had finally died. And Mark was acting like a martyr. He was ready to be persecuted by me. He wanted to be the guy who stood up to the big bad doctor. Phil and defended his right to be broke and holy. But here's the thing about me. I don't care about your holiness if it's built on a foundation of broken promises and abandoned responsibilities. I don't care how many community gardens you think you're planting if you're letting your own garden at home turn to dust and weeds. We're talking about a man who had a fiduciary and moral responsibility to his family, and he had traded that in for a cheap hit of self-importance. He called it giving. I called it fleeing. He wasn't running toward a higher calling. He was running away from the crushing weight of being a provider in a world that never told him he was enough. As we walked out onto that stage, I knew this wasn't going to be a standard stop spending money conversation. This was a surgical operation on a man's identity. We had to get past the checks, past the donations, and past the pseudo-spiritual jargon. We had to get down to the raw, bleeding part of Mark that felt like he didn't exist unless he was being someone's hero. Because until we fixed that, he would keep giving until there was nothing left of him but a ghost. And Sarah? She was standing there with a shovel, ready to bury the marriage if I couldn't find a way to bring her husband back from the ledge. The audience was quiet. They didn't know whether to clap for his generosity or hiss at his irresponsibility. That's the gray area I love to work in, because life isn't lived in the black and white. It's lived in that messy, uncomfortable middle where a good intention can become a devastating weapon. Mark sat in that chair, adjusted his jacket, and looked at me like he was ready for a fight. I just leaned back, took a breath, and asked him the one question he wasn't expecting. I didn't ask him about the money. I asked him, "Mark, who are you trying to pay back? Because it sure as hell isn't Elias." The question hung in the air like a heavy fog. I could see the gears grinding behind Mark's eyes. He had come prepared to defend his mission, to debate the ethics of wealth, and to justify his generosity. He hadn't come prepared to look into a mirror. He cleared his throat, straightened his posture, that classic "I'm the smartest guy in the room" move, and said, "I'm not paying anyone back, Dr. Phil. I'm simply choosing not to be a slave to the dollar anymore. I'm choosing to live a life of meaning." I leaned in, and I didn't let him off the hook. I told him, "Mark, you're a smart man. You've managed multi-million-dollar projects. You know that every action has a reaction, and every debt has a source. You didn't just wake up one day and decide to be Street Francis of Assisi. You woke up and decided you couldn't stand the man you saw in the mirror. You're trying to buy your way out of a debt you think you owe to your father. You're trying to prove to a dead man that you're good because he only ever told you that you were productive. But here's the problem. You're paying that debt with your wife's future and your children's security. That's not charity. That's theft covered in a thin layer of self-righteousness. The audience was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Sarah was sitting next to him, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. I turned to her and asked, "Sarah, tell him what it feels like to watch your life's work walk out the door in the hands of people who wouldn't even remember his name if he stopped writing checks." She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She spoke with a quiet, devastating clarity. She said, "It feels like I'm married to a ghost. It feels like our 20 years together meant nothing compared to the high he gets from a stranger's thank you. Mark, you aren't saving people. You're abandoned us." Our youngest daughter had to turn down her dream school because the tuition fund is gone. She's working 2 jobs now, and she cries herself to sleep because she thinks you don't love her enough to protect her. How is that holy? Mark tried to interrupt. He tried to go back to his script about spiritual growth and detachment from the material, but I stopped him. I told him, "Listen to me. There is a very thin line between a breakthrough and a breakdown. You've convinced yourself you've had a breakthrough, but from where I'm sitting, you're having a slow motion breakdown. You're addicted to the feeling of being a savior because for 40 years, you felt like a servant. You've traded one master for another. You used to work for a corporation, now you work for your own ego. And the currency you're using is your family's blood, sweat, and tears." This is where the confrontation gets uncomfortable, because I had to strip away the saint mask. I had my team do some digging into the people Mark had been helping. We found Elias. We found some of the others. And I showed Mark the reality he had been ignoring. I showed him the social media post of one of his charity cases, laughing about the sucker who was paying for his vacations. I showed him the records of another person using his gift to buy drugs. I said, "Mark, you didn't do your due diligence. You didn't care where the money went. You only cared about how it made you feel when you gave it. You weren't investing in their lives, you were investing in your own narrative. You wanted to be the hero of a story where everyone else is a victim, including your wife. You've turned Sarah into the villain because she's the only one holding you accountable to the real world. You call her materialistic because she wants to pay the mortgage. I call her grounded. I call you delusional." He started to crack. The vacant serenity I'd noticed earlier began to flicker. His eyes darted around the room. He was looking for an exit, but there wasn't one. He was on my stage, in front of his wife, and in front of a world that was tired of his excuses. He whispered, "I just wanted to do something that mattered. I spent my whole life being a success by everyone else's standards, and I was miserable. I thought if I gave it all away, I'd finally be free." I told him, freedom isn't the absence of responsibility, it's the choice of which responsibilities are worth carrying. You walked away from the most important responsibilities a man can have, being a husband and a father, to chase a ghost. You can't find peace by creating chaos for the people who love you. That's not how the universe works. You don't get to be a saint at your family's expense. We sat there for a long time, just letting that sink in. I wanted him to feel the weight of it. I wanted him to feel the crater he had created. I brought out a video message from his oldest daughter, who couldn't be there because she was working a shift at a diner to save up for her books. She didn't talk about the money. She talked about the man who used to read her bedtime stories, the man who used to be her hero because he was there, not because he was rich. She said, "Dad, I don't want your money. I want my father back. I want the man who cared about me more than he cared about being right." That was the breakthrough moment. Not a grand epiphany about the meaning of life, but a raw, painful realization of the damage he'd done, Mark started to sob. It wasn't the polite, quiet crying of someone who is sorry they got caught. It was the gut-wrenching, ugly cry of a man who finally realizes he's been burning down his own house while convinced he was clearing the land for a park. I walked over and sat on the edge of the stage near him. I told him, "Mark, you've spent $500,000 trying to buy a new soul, but your soul was never lost. It was just buried under a lot of pain and a lot of shoulds. You don't need to give away your money to be a good man. You need to be present, you need to be honest, and you need to start the long, hard work of earning back the trust you've shattered. You're 45 years old, you're at the halfway point. You can spend the next 40 years making amends, or you can spend them in a tent somewhere telling yourself you're a martyr while your family moves on without you. Which is it going to be?" Sarah reached out her hand, but she didn't touch him. Not yet. She was waiting to see if the old Mark was actually in there or if the new Mark had completely erased him. The choice was entirely his. We had reached the point where the talking stops and the doing begins. I've seen people choose both paths. I've seen men walk away from the stage and go right back to their delusions because the truth is too much to bear. And I've seen men roll up their sleeves and start the grueling process of rebuilding a life from the ashes. Mark looked up at me, his face red and swollen, and he said, "I don't even know where to start. I don't have anything left." I looked him right in the eye and said, "You have your breath, you have your brain, and you have a wife who is still sitting in that chair instead of walking out that door. That's a hell of a lot more than nothing. But the first thing you're going to do is apologize to your wife. Not for not understanding your journey, but for being a selfish, arrogant man who put his ego above his family's survival. Can you do that?" He turned to Sarah. He didn't have a script this time. He didn't have any philosophical quotes. He just looked at her and said, "I'm so sorry. I've been so incredibly lost." The weight of that apology was more than just words. It was the sound of a man finally surrendering his ego. You see, Mark had been walking around with this invisible crown of thorns he'd fashioned for himself, convinced that his suffering and the suffering he was causing his family was some kind of noble sacrifice. But when he looked at Sarah, truly looked at her for the first time in months, he didn't see a materialistic obstacle. He saw a woman who had been his partner, his cheerleader, and his rock, and he realized he'd been treating her like an enemy for the crime of trying to keep their lives from falling apart. It's a bitter pill to swallow when you realize your enlightenment was actually just a sophisticated form of narcissism. After the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, that's when the real work began. I don't believe in magic wand solutions. I don't think a guest walks off my stage and suddenly everything is fixed. What happens on that stage is a disruption of a toxic pattern, but the reconstruction of a life happens in the quiet, mundane moments back home. I arranged for Mark and Sarah to work with a team of professionals, financial advisors who specialize in crisis management, and a psychologist who understood the deep-seated savior complex Mark was battling. Because let's be clear, Mark was an addict. He wasn't addicted to a substance, he was addicted to the moral high of being the hero. And like any addict, he was going to face a massive withdrawal the moment he stopped writing those checks. The ride home was, according to Sarah, the longest 3 hours of her life. They didn't talk much. The silence wasn't the vacant serenity Mark had been sporting before. It was the heavy, awkward silence of two people standing in the middle of a battlefield after the smoke has cleared. When they pulled into their driveway and saw the foreclosure pending notice taped to the front door, the reality of what Mark had done finally hit him with the force of a freight train. He told me later that he stood on his lawn and vomited. He had spent his life building that house, filling it with memories and security, and he had essentially handed the keys to strangers because he was too afraid to face his own internal emptiness. In the weeks that followed, Mark had to do something he hadn't done in 20 years. He had to ask for help without being the one in control. He had to go to the bank and admit he'd made catastrophic errors. He had to call the people he'd given money to, people like Elias, and ask for it back. Now, this is where the cold, hard truth of human nature comes in. When Mark called Elias and explained the situation, expecting even a fraction of the grace he thought he'd been cultivating, Elias didn't offer a cent. In fact, he blocked Mark's number. The community Mark thought he was building vanished the moment the faucet turned off. That's a brutal lesson. You can't buy loyalty, and you certainly can't buy a soul. Most of the people he'd saved weren't interested in his redemption. They were interested in his bank account. Mark had to take a job as a junior associate at a firm run by a man 10 years younger than him. For a guy who had been a high-level project manager, that was a massive blow to his pride. He was back to hitting targets and managing bottom lines, but this time, he wasn't doing it for his father's ghost. He was doing it to pay back the tuition he had drained from his daughter's accounts. He was doing it to keep the roof over their heads. I checked in with him about 2 months after the show, and he sounded exhausted. He told me, "Dr. Phil, I used to think my old life was a prison, but I realize now that the prison wasn't the job or the money. The prison was my need to be seen as something special. Now, I'm just a guy who works 40 hours a week and comes home to a wife who is still deciding if she can ever trust me again." And strangely, this feels more like the truth than anything I felt when I was giving that money away. We talk a lot about forgiveness in our culture, but we don't talk enough about restitution. Forgiveness is a gift someone gives you. Restitution is the work you do to deserve it. Mark was in the restitution phase. He started attending a support group for people who had blown up their lives through impulsive behavior. He began to see the patterns of how his father's transactional love had created a hole in him that no amount of money or altruism could ever fill. He started to understand that his father's approval wasn't something he could earn posthumously by being a saint. He had to learn to be enough just as a man who fulfills his promises. The hardest part, though, was the daughters. Rebuilding a relationship with a child who has been deprioritized for a stranger's benefit is a long uphill climb. His youngest daughter, the one who had to work 2 jobs, didn't welcome him back with open arms. She didn't care about his breakthrough on national television. She cared about the fact that she was exhausted and stressed because her father had decided her future wasn't as important as his ego. Mark had to learn to sit in that pain. He had to learn to let her be angry without trying to fix it or explain it away with his pseudo-spiritual jargon. He had to earn her respect back one day at a time, one shift at a time, by showing up and being the father she actually needed, not the angel he wanted to be. Sarah, to her immense credit, stayed, not because she had to, and not because she was materialistic, but because she saw the man she'd married finally beginning to emerge from the wreckage. They started going to marriage counseling twice a week. They had to learn a new language, a language that didn't involve worth or debts or spiritual growth, but focused on safety, transparency, and partnership. They had to redo their entire financial structure. Sarah took over the accounts. Mark agreed to a strict allowance. For a 45-year-old man, that's incredibly humbling, but he didn't fight it. He knew he'd lost his right to hold the checkbook when he used it as a weapon against his own family's future. I remember a follow-up call I had with them about 6 months later. Mark sounded different. The vacant serenity was gone, replaced by a weary but genuine presence. He told me they were still in the house, thanks to a grueling repayment plan and Sarah's incredible organizational skills. He said, "Doctor, Phil, I'm never going to have that $500,000 back. It's gone. I've had to accept that I set fire to my retirement and my security, but for the first time in my life, I'm not trying to be a hero. I'm just trying to be a husband. And it's the hardest job I've ever had. but it's the only one that actually matters. Looking back at Mark's case, it serves as a stark reminder that you can't buy a shortcut to emotional health. We live in a society that is obsessed with the grand gesture. We love the movies where someone quits their career, sells every possession they own, and finds enlightenment on a distant mountaintop. But in the real world, you don't find your soul by leaving your wife to figure out how to pay the mortgage or the electric bill. You find your character in the way you treat the people who have no choice but to rely on you. Mark's journey wasn't about the $500,000 he lost. It was about the integrity he had to find within himself. He had to realize that being good isn't a performance you put on for strangers. It's a commitment you make to your family every single day, even when it's boring, even when it's exhausting, and even when nobody is there to clap for you. I checked in with Sarah one last time a few months ago. She told me that Mark had just finished paying back the first of the 2 college funds. He did it by working massive amounts of overtime, taking on consulting jobs he used to think were beneath him, and living a life that was anything but grand. But she also said that for the first time in their marriage, she felt like she actually knew who he was. The masks were gone. The hero was dead. In his place was a man who was tired, yes, but a man who was finally, undeniably real. And at the end of the day, that's a hell of a lot more valuable than any bank balance. You can always make more money, but you only get one chance to be the man your family needs you to be. Mark finally stepped up to the plate. It wasn't pretty, and it sure as hell wasn't easy, but it was honest. I often tell people that you don't have a soul, you are a soul. You have a body. Mark was trying to save his soul by starving his family's future. It was a misplaced effort based on a faulty premise. But the transformation I saw in him, the way his shoulders dropped from the weight of pretending and squared up to the weight of reality, that's why I do what I do. It's about stripping away the lies we tell ourselves so we can live with the truth. Mark is now a man who understands that his worth isn't tied to what he gives away, but to what he stands for. He stands for his wife. He stands for his daughters. And he stands for a version of himself that no longer needs a stranger's approval to feel whole. The psychological fallout for Mark's daughters was perhaps the most difficult part of this entire process. Trust is like a mirror. Once it's shattered, you can glue it back together, but you're always going to see the cracks. Mark had to learn that an apology is just a start. It's not a finish line. He spent weekends helping his youngest study, not because he was a savior, but because he was a father. He attended the soccer games he used to skip for those philanthropic meetings. He became mundane. And in that mundanity, he found the holiness he had been searching for in all the wrong places. He realized that the greatest act of charity isn't giving money to a stranger, it's giving your time and your heart to the people who actually know your name and rely on your presence. I remember him telling me in our last conversation, Dr. Phil, I used to think I was special because I was different. Now I realize I'm special because I'm theirs. That's a profound shift. It's the shift from narcissism to connection. He stopped trying to be an icon and started trying to be an anchor. And while they are still living in a smaller house and driving much older cars, the atmosphere in that home is no longer one of fear and confusion. It's one of recovery. It's a quiet, hard-earned peace that doesn't require a bank statement to validate. That's the real outcome we look for. It's not always a happy ending where the money miraculously reappears or the debt is forgiven by the bank. Sometimes the outcome is simply the grace to start over with nothing but your word and the people who are willing to give you a second chance. And if you've got that, you're richer than you ever were when you had $1 million and a hollow heart. Mark is walking that path now. One step at a time, one day at a time. And he's doing it with his head held high, not as a saint, but as a man who finally knows the value of what he almost threw away. He is home, and for the first time in 45 years, he is actually present